Welcome to another episode of Free Thinkers Anonymous. Today we're going to break down what it's like to work in the VFX industry. And so we're going to hand things over to Jeremy.
Yeah. So there's two different kind of juxtapositions I'd like to do. One is comparing a visual effects day in the life to just a normal desk job, because I feel like most people can relate to that. And then another phase where I go day in the life of a visual effects artist compared to other people in the film industry, because then you get to see this is how the film industry is treated in general, and then this is how visual effects is treated even though they're in the same industry, just because they don't happen to be on set. So, normal day, you go to work, there might be a little bit of security, you might have a key card to swipe in, but you get to work, go up in the elevator, you've got big open windows, go to the break room, chat with your coworkers. Oh, you can't log in? That's fine. Get an IT person to help you out with that. You run into any other IT related problems, there's somebody to help you out. Don't even worry about it. There's, even though there is work to be done every day, there's still not a drastic sense of urgency every day. And when you're working, you do the work that you need to do as assigned by your boss, and you generally don't get that much feedback on it. You're like, oh, here you go. And the boss is like, oh, thanks. And then that's the last you hear about that individual item that you just delivered to them. But maybe some bosses give a little bit more feedback than others. But usually you'll have quarterly, biannual, or annual reviews where you have your manager kind of break down the pros and cons of how you're doing your work. So that's a normal desk job. And then we have visual effects jobs. So when you walk into the office for the first time, you use a key card. When you go to the floor you're on, you use another key card. When you log into your machine, you have your password, and then you probably have a two-factor authentication where you send a push to your phone, and then that actually allows you to get into your machine. But then you have to put your phone away, because if you have your phone out, you might be fired on the spot, because they might think that you're trying to record video of whatever clips you were assigned for the project. So there are extensive security protocols. It also means blackout curtains on every window. They don't want anybody with a telephoto lens from outside the building recording anything that's happening inside the building from multiple buildings away. So you are not ever allowed to have open windows when you're working on Disney, Marvel, any feature film. That is also, you're basically expected to be your own IT, because everybody is constantly running into technical issues. So your IT department is people that handle the network side of things, and they'll handle the development of new tools. But it's very rare that you're starting to run into problems with just how to use the software that you're using, and you can call somebody to come take a look at it and help you figure out what's going wrong. We all have to be problem solvers, because we are all basically our own IT, unless we work in a super large studio. And even then, half the time, not really going to help you out that much. We also are at our desk pretty much all day. Break room chats are strongly discouraged. There's kind of a constant looming threat of urgency, too. Like, even when you don't actually feel the urgency, there's still a threat of urgency, because you know that this film has to be released in 3 months. So you've got 2 months with the entire team to do every single shot that's on the floor. You might be like, hey, we've only delivered a quarter of the shots, and we've already spent 2 months on it. So you can't really rush into anything just yet, because you're still waiting on things from the client. But you know that you're going to be doing insane hours later on. So you need to be completely done with everything that's in front of you when that huge tidal wave hits, because otherwise it's just going to be a mess. But then on top of that, where normal jobs, you have your yearly reviews where they tell you what you did right, what you did wrong. With visual effects jobs, it's all day, every day, you are told what you did wrong. For good leads, for good supervisors, there is a balance there, where they'll try to what's called sandwiching their reviews, where they'll say, "Hey, I'm reviewing the shot you're working on. This stuff is working really well. This stuff is not working well, but I think you're in the right direction." That type of feedback. But much more likely, it's just going to be these are the notes. You deliver a shot that you think looks good, potentially ready to be in the movie, and they say, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. They give it back to you, you fix that. If it's not perfect, they call out what's wrong, you send it back to them again. So every day, day in, day out, you are in a black room, basically figuring everything out your own, not really supposed to chat with the people around you too much. Everything's weighing down on you, and you're constantly being told what you did wrong.
Oh yeah.
So you might understand why visual effects artists tend to be very depressed individuals. uh, but Marvin, Mike, like, do you guys feel like that assessment is accurate for visual effects jobs? Like, what has it been like that for you guys in the industry? Because I know when we've worked together, it's been similar to that at least. But yeah, I'm curious if the other studios you guys have worked at have been that way. Because I will say the studio I'm working for now is not like that at all. It's remote work, and on top of that, it's not high profile feature films, so there's less security protocols. And on top of that, there is an IT person that actually does help out with things that go wrong. And on top of that, they really do push for a work life balance, which is an extremely rare thing in our industry, from what I found. So even though that kind of horror scenario is very regular in the film industry, it's not everywhere. Occasionally, you will find little pockets of good studios that do things where they actually treat their artists as people. But yeah, so curious your guys' take on that interpretation of the film industry in general.
Yeah, I think I'll let Marvin go first.
Yeah, man, it sounds like a horror film right there. It's been a mixed bag, in my experience. There have been situations where it kind of just seemed like in that manner. You can kind of feel the tension in the studio with the deadlines, trying to get everything out. Everyone's trying to meet quota. Everything's quick, like, hey, here are notes, fix them. And then there's other times where it's just really kind of the opposite, where there's, hey, we're all here, we're making great stuff. The work life balance that studios try to give the artists. It's a mix, especially in the beginning of a project. Things are still being worked out, so you have work and there isn't too much pressure. And you
Mhm.
start feeling it when at the very end, when clients start to change almost everything. And you're like, what? That's like,
Mhm.
okay. And then it just switches just like that. And now everything's just pressure and stress. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
it's a mix.
Dude, I can't even imagine how the artists working on Sonic felt when they're like, "Oh
Ooh.
yeah, we're gonna
Oh,
completely
gee.
change the character design and start from scratch." I'm like, "What?" I understand the backlash. I understand the way that viewers responded. And also, I don't think the artists were the ones to create that design for Sonic. I think the director created that design for Sonic. And the artists were probably like, this is horrible. Why are we doing it this way? But that's what they were tasked to do.
Yeah,
But there
I
was
think
a project that we all worked on, at least early on in my career, that I know they reshot like 20 minutes of footage. And we had like 2 weeks to get the entire film out. So that was fun because that was during like the crazy crunch too at the beginning of our time together at that studio. So yeah, it's a thing. It happens regularly.
Yeah.
and I think one, just to touch back on Sonic, that's a great example of these artists came in, worked really hard, and the fans, initially there was a lot of positive feedback and people were happy that they made the changes, but then that studio went under.
Hmm.
I'm pretty sure they had to work a ton of overtime, went way over budget, and they were bragging the fact that they didn't go over budget. Any person just paying attention would say, like, how can that be?
Right.
You had to redo everything with the character in it. That's why we highlight the fact that it can be a very thankless job. I tip my hat off to all those artists who put in that time and effort. And thing that people don't fully understand is we want to do a good job. We don't want to put something out there that looks bad because we know people are going to get a lot of harsh criticism based on how it turned out.
Hmm.
And it reflects on us. Now we got to put that on our reel. We got to show that to other people, yeah, this is the work I did. So more often than not, you want to do stuff that looks really good and that you're proud of so that you can show it off and say, hey, I want to get more work. I want to stay employed. But to cycle back that we all used to work together at the same studio. If you know our industry, we all sign NDAs. We all can't talk bad about any employer that you've been at. But at the same time, there's so many things that we've been involved with that's never come to light to the public. We're still working artists and we respect the fact that, yeah, there's some things that you can't talk about. Just to be clear, there's an article out there where people are, dropping their own names, but if they're going out there and giving specific details, we will highlight that. No doubt, no
Hmm.
question. We're not
Yeah.
shying away from that, but just from our own personal experiences, just to keep in mind as a general disclaimer to the audience that don't expect us to name specific names when we're
Yeah.
talking about these things.
Yeah, that's not gonna happen.
Yeah, but we will say that in our general experience working in the industry, on average, we tend to work mostly a 10-hour day. A lot of studios have that as a standard, and
Hmm.
things ramp up. So I'm just going to talk about the kind of hours that we work.
Mm.
Yeah, we tend to work 10-hour days, and then and that's when things are kind of slow. We might drop down to like 8-hour a day work week, 40 hours a week. We're having a party, man. People are having long lunches at the local
Yeah.
bar, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. 40-hour weeks are a vacation for us.
When we're actually working, we tend to work 50 to 60 hours a week. And that's
Mhm.
just when we're working normally. But then, as tends to happen, we gotta and work longer hours when we're trying to deliver a project, and that could jump up to 72 to 80 hours. And yeah, on average, during times like that, we will work weekends. And we do work a good amount of holidays. Only if it's a really major holiday do we have the time off. And fortunately, I think we do tend to have closer to the holidays off. But if it's a regular, like, yo, man, if the kids are out of school, we're probably working.
There was a period of time where we, I want to say it was like 2.5 to 3 months where we didn't have a single day off. You worked a 12-hour day Monday through Saturday and then an 8-hour day on Sunday, and you were required to take an hour-long lunch break and a half-hour-long dinner break. So it effectively was 13 and a half hours, 6 days a week, and 9 hours on the last day of the week, where you had to be at work. I generally just skipped lunch altogether, which was terrible for my health. I
Yeah.
generally skipped dinner whenever I could as well. And I just ate when I got home because I wanted to spend a little bit of time with my fiance at the time, trying to plan my wedding. And I got to the point where I literally forgot what it was like to not be at work. And I don't mean like to not have that job. I mean, like, I don't remember what it was like to not be in the building or
Mhm.
traveling to or from the building. Being at home, I would just sleep because that's all I could do. And then I'd shower in the morning, go right back to work every single day. Like, my fiance had to do laundry because I was never available to do laundry. Laundromats weren't open late at night on a Sunday, and I couldn't do it during the week. So how else was I going to get clean clothes? Like, she did all the grocery shopping. How else was I going to grocery shop? I still don't know how single artists that didn't have roommates were doing it. Like, I have no idea how you could live like that without somebody to remind you what it was like outside of that.
I think one of the funniest stories is I remember our team, a bunch of them got new girlfriends, and that was before we were working crazy hours. And they all
Hmm.
thought they could keep their relationships. And that's something that we kind of warned them. I don't think it's going to work out. Typically, a lot of people dated within the studio. It was very difficult to date outside,
Hmm.
unless you're a player like Marvin, it happened.
Oh, no, not at all.
Uh, it's funny. I thought you were gonna get into our late night volleyball games because that's the other thing is that we had so many artists at the morning shift and the night shift So we got stuck as the night shift for a good, I don't know, maybe a month. And so we were there, we got in at like 2 or 3 p.m. or something, and then we had to stay there until like after 3 o'clock in the morning. So what we would do is for our dinner break was at midnight, 1 a.m. So nobody was actually looking to eat dinner at that time. So our whole team would go out to a volleyball court that was nearby with a glow in the dark volleyball and just play night volleyball for 20 minutes and then go right back to work because that was all the time that we had to socialize, to exercise. Like we had to do something. So that was our thing.
Once you hit those hours and you start getting all like delirious and you're just on autopilot, some crazy stuff be
Mhm.
happening.
Just to continue from that and just go about work experience just as a freelancer, which is pretty different than having a steady studio gig, which
Mm.
we take for granted. We work from half a year to a year at a single location. That's being at a place long term. I think
Mhm.
we've only had an experience of working with one studio consistently for a few years at best, but
Mhm.
we're usually moving around. It's
Yeah.
very much come in, do your job. Hopefully, you make good connections. They appreciate what you do, and you move on. And maybe you'll cycle back to that place later on. But we're always moving. I think that's something more people can probably relate to today. I think that's more common for people to not really be in one job for a long period of time. I think that's
Mhm.
something our parents and grandparents experience. But with our industry, that's just what it is. If you're a freelancer, you're going to keep moving around. And just to kind of touch on how things have changed of late with lockdowns, that forced things to open up and start to switch to more remote work. So it's been a positive in different cases in which we're not forced to work long hours all the time. And we do sometimes get situations where we could work somewhere that does offer 8-hour work days.
Mhm.
And there's a little more freedom and flexibility with when you can come in and out. It's not as strict as being inside a studio where every dollar matters, every minute counts.
Mhm.
I think we probably had actually better experiences within the past few years freelancing when we have consistent work.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, we have more of a turnaround than we used to. And that's something that we have to adapt to and be comfortable with. In a future segment, we will talk more about why visual effects studios are going to be unionizing.
Mhm.
I think we're starting to paint a picture as to why that may be an issue.
Right. When we need to look up the laws on how many hours a job can require you to work while being justified in laying you off, I was well acquainted with California and the national laws when it came to how many hours they could require you to work. And if you didn't work those hours, they could legally lay you off. Basically, there is no limit. The only jobs that you are protected from being required to work too many hours is doctors and truck drivers. Like, that's it. If you falling asleep on the job is going to kill you or someone else, or pilots, those are the types of things where there's protections. But for us,
Mm,
well, you might die on the way to or from work from exhaustion, but that's fine because you didn't die or kill someone while you were at work because you fell asleep at work. Like that's where the line is. Again, kind of difference between typical job and visual effects job is the duration of contracts. I've had contracts that are literally 24-hour contracts where they're like, hey, we shot this thing for a project and we didn't realize that there's this thing in it and the director called it out and it needs to be delivered tomorrow at this time. And they were like, can you help us out? So for the next 24 hours, from the time they contacted me until 24 hours later, I was awake and I was working that entire time to get this project out in time. Now, sure, I made a little bit of extra money because of that, but also I was useless for the next 2 days because I was up for, like, I had already been up for probably 12 hours that day when I got that call. So I was up for 36 hours working for 2/3 of that time. You can have those really rushed, really short projects that leave you kind of jet lagged at the end of it. And then you can have the other side of things. It was over 2 years in the end for this one individual project. Scope of work was continually changing. The pipeline we were using was continually changing. everything was kind of in flux almost the full duration of the project. But it was a single project for one client, and that very rarely happens. Usually, even if you're at a reliable studio where you're an employee, if you make it 2, 3 years, that's amazing. But even then, you're still going to be working on multiple different projects throughout that duration. It's extremely rare that you're just working on one project the whole time.
Right.
I've heard that for Avatar, that's the case. Avatar 2, 3, and 4, the artists that are working on that are just working on Avatar. Like, they are basically locked into that project and they're not doing anything but working on that project.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's very rare. So there's a really wide array of things that happen. But typically, I'd say 3 to 4 months is what you can generally expect for a contract. And that's generally going to be for an individual project, maybe 2 or 3 projects that you cover while you're at that studio. And if you are a contracted employee, you don't get any benefits, PTO, you don't get holidays, you don't get a 401k, you don't get anything. They don't handle your taxes. You got to figure out all that yourself. So most people have W-2s. They have their taxes taken out as they get their paycheck. So at the end of the year, hey, you may get a tax return for a certain amount of money, maybe a few $1,000s. That doesn't happen for us because most of us are contracted employees, which means that if we don't take the taxes out of our paycheck, the taxes don't get taken out of our paycheck. So we might make, just throwing a random number out there, let's say $10,000 in a month, which doesn't happen, but let's just say it happens. If you don't put away $2,000 of that for taxes, then you are going to owe $2,000 just for that individual month at the end of the year. If you make 120K, well, let's just say 100K at the end of the year, you are going to owe $20,000. And if you have not put that money aside and set that aside for taxes, you are going to owe the IRS $20,000 that you were not anticipating. And this compounds very easily when you're working these insane hours and you forget to do taxes because you forget to do everything. You forget to do dishes, you forget to do laundry, you forget to make food, you forget to go grocery shopping. Forgetting to do taxes kind of makes sense. And so then when the IRS comes after you, it's 2 years of income that you have to catch up on paying taxes, particularly for artists that are newer in the industry that aren't aware of the way the taxes work. It can hit them really, really hard. Also, with contract work, depending on the way the studio's set up, most studios don't actually pay you overtime. It is very dependent on the structure of the studio. Mike, I know you got me in with that one very small studio that's not around anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And they just paid you per shot. It wasn't paid per hour.
Oof.
Yeah, that was, you know how rough that was because the dollar signs on those shots.
Yeah, for anyone wondering what that must feel like, just imagine like you're a barista and you get paid for every cup of coffee that you serve, so that's a worst case scenario that you ever want to be in. So I suggest if any visual effects artists are listening, avoid those like the plague because
Yeah.
I think that studio, I don't know why that sounds familiar, but maybe I interviewed with them at one point, and I think I heard about that too. I think that was the first time I heard of that concept of a per shot basis.
Mm-hmm.
And it's still very iffy now to do that because you just never know with notes and changes and everything.
Yeah. So with all newer artists, Mike actually has an artist that he's mentoring and he asked for some advice. And my big thing with all new artists is never work on a per project basis if you are a new artist. Ever. Never, ever, ever. I did it multiple times to my detriment every single time. I think every time I worked on a per project or per shot basis, I was generally making in like the $2 to $3 an hour range because I didn't know what went into these shots. I always thought they were easier than they were. And I never had a structure set up for reviews. And there was no quality expectations that were clearly communicated. So if I delivered something, it might look amazing, but it might not be what the client was expecting. So they wanted changes. And then they still didn't like that. So they want more changes. They still didn't like that. They want more changes. I've now done 4 iterations of this one individual shot, taking the time of doing 4 individual shots, and I only got paid for it once. And this was compounding on projects. Like even for more
That's
experienced artists, I'm like, don't ever work on a per shot per project basis unless you have number one done tests. If there's a certain effect that they want you to do, you need to test out on your machine using your software, like however you're going to be doing it on production for this project, you need to test how long it's going to take you. Once you know how long it's going to take you, then you figure out how many times you need to do that. And then you have to figure, okay, well, there's also answering emails from the client. There's also all the other things that go into managing basically your own company. Always have quality expectations established ahead of time, tests done to figure out how long things are going to take, and always have a set number of reviews established ahead of time, with the understanding that I'm going to be sending you professional quality of work. That's just the general way that you would phrase it. This is what gets delivered regularly in the industry. With that understanding, as long as I meet that expectation, you get 2 rounds of notes. So that way they're not going to be super, super nitpicky. They have 1 round to be like, hey, this isn't really going the right direction. And they can have you pivot, and they still have a round of notes to kind of finesse a little bit more. But that way, no matter what notes they give, it still has to follow the scope of work that was laid out in detail at the beginning of the project. And if it doesn't, and they're adding on new things, then you can discuss change orders with them and have a system built in for change orders where they add in extra shots, lengthen the duration of shots, change what they want done on certain shots. And I generally would say balloon any number you send their way by at least 20%, with the understanding that something's going to go wrong. Something always goes wrong in every production I've ever worked on. So be ready for it. We anticipate 20% increase. That way, if for some reason things go perfectly right, maybe you can cut them a deal at the end of the project. Or maybe you can pocket that money depending on how you want things to go with that client. If they're happy with paying the extra 20%, then pocket the money. If they're not happy with paying that extra 20%, but you explain to them why that's there, and then at the end you're like, I really would like this as a repeat client, then you're like, hey, we were under budget by this much, I'm going to send that back your way. If you work cost plus, that's another good way to do it, where if it goes way over budget, you don't have to eat that yourself. Like if you spend a lot more time on this project than you were anticipating, you're not liable for that. The client is liable for that. However, if you want to maintain a good relationship with that client, you will give them as much of a heads up as possible, because that's crucial. Hourly pay is almost always the way you want to go unless there's an explicit reason to do it otherwise. And then you can just give them estimates. I think it's going to take me this much time. My time is this much per hour. And so just multiply those two. That's how much I think it's going to take. If it starts to take longer than that, I'll give you a heads up. That's probably the best way to do it as a contracted employee, whether you're working directly for a non VFX studio client, or if you are working for a VFX studio as the client. That way you don't have to eat the cost of working extra hours, because that is extremely discouraging every single time.
All right. I think we're going to end it there for this week. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Special thanks for Jeremy and Marvin. And please tune in next week when we dive even further into the VFX industry.